Beauty work is one of these invisible arts. If done correctly, a beauty retouch should not be noticeable at all. Of course, this is true for almost all visual effects work, but with beauty work, it is especially true, because we, as humans, are so used to looking at other humans' faces. So any imperfections in the masks, any wandering brush strokes will be visible immediately. With Head Track ML inside of Silhouette, you'll have a stable track of your talent in no time. I'm Christoph Zapletal for Boris FX. Let's track some heads. The glue that holds any good beauty work together is a rock-solid track. While our talents move around, shake their heads, and do what human heads normally do, the masks and paint strokes that hide blemishes, crow's feet, or wrinkles need to be rock-solid and pixel-perfect. Usually, you'd stabilize one part of the image, maybe with a mocha track. Work on that part, reapply the motion, and then move on to the next bit. Nothing wrong with that, but there could be issues. Suddenly, a part of the face would be obscured, then reappear again. The full strain of hair would move over all those nice tracking details you just picked out. If something like that happens, you'll quickly find yourself spending hours working on your shot frame by frame. But what if we just track the entire head with a 3D mesh? That way, we could then unwrap the whole head as a texture to work on. Sounds wild and complicated? Give me 30 seconds with Head Track ML to convince you otherwise. So here, I've got a fresh silhouette scene with a typical shot for a beauty commercial. The movement is not crazy, but there's some stuff going on. The talent tilts and slightly rotates her head. The hand comes in and touches the nose, and she starts to smile. With traditional means, we couldn't cover all those movements and deformations in a single track. But let's see how Silhouette's Head Track ML will deal with this. To track a head, we'll need a 3D scene node, as we are about to create a 3D mesh. In the top left, next to the viewer, right below the synthesize icon, we can find this little head, which will lead us directly to the head tracking part of the node. Now down here, the Head Track ML interface appears, and as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. We can choose to either track heads or anchors. Heads is pretty self-explanatory, and we'll get into anchors a little bit later on. For now, let me just hit the Process Forward button. A ML model will load into the graphics card and detect the head in the scene. Once it has found that, Silhouette will show us a 3D mesh of the head, correctly aligned and scaled. And then it will process the entire clip and track that mesh. When it's done, Silhouette will add a couple of things to my objects list over here. A scene, a camera, a null object, and a head. We don't need to go into any detail about the first three. They are basically a necessity for Silhouette to give us a representation of the head in 3D space. So let's see what that actually looks like. Up here, I'll switch to my quad view, and now I can actually see the talent's head move in 3D space. That's awesome. But to make this not only a shiny party trick, but actually usable for us, we need to unwrap the texture. If you're already familiar with 3D, then you'll probably go, of course, dummy, what else would you want to do with it? But if you're new to this, let me quickly explain. Think of the texture like a wrapper around a piece of candy. If I want to paint on this wrapper, it's far easier to do it in this state than when it's already wrapped around the candy. Taking this example back to our scene inside of Silhouette, the texture of the head is now tightly wrapped around the 3D mesh. We need to unwrap it to put the texture of all these different elements of the mesh onto a single, stable 2D surface. To do that, we'll need an unwrap node. I'll connect the data port of the 3D scene node into the data port of the unwrap node, and the footage will come straight from here. Now this looks wild, doesn't it? Okay, let me create a second viewer here and show you what's going on. Here, we've got our tracked head with a mesh overlay, and here we've got the unwrapped texture. So while the mesh itself moves around the scene, this part here will always stick to its counterpart on the mesh. Now, unlike with a candy wrapper, Silhouette has no idea what's on the back of the tracked head, as that information was never filmed. So to have something there, the texture is mirrored. That's what we're seeing on the edges. But the interesting part is here in the center of the frame. See how that stays stable while the talent moves around the head? Great. Let's add a paint node and remove this mole. Well, this is not as stable as I thought it would be. The ML model did a good job, and if we would apply some broad effects, this would be great. But if we want this really locked down, we need to go in there and give this another level of accuracy. The mesh is already animating with the face movements of our talent, like here where she's smiling. We just need to get that last bit of inaccuracy out of this. We can do this by adding additional deformers to the mesh. Let's just select the mesh in the objects list and press Add Deformer. If we then click on any part of the mesh, this little deformer gets created, and that guy allows me to, well, deform the mesh. I can use this to just move my mesh better into place, or I can chug along and hand animate this over time. Pretty useful, but remember that we can not only track heads, but also anchors? Take a look. Inside the deformer category, this little thing is actually called an anchor. Now I'll add a couple of these and place them on features that should track pretty well. Now each of these little anchors will run its own little point track ML tracker to further improve the accuracy of the mesh. So let's take a look at the unwrapped version. Yeah, this unwrapped texture is really stable now, and I can start painting away. Okay, this works, but looking at the unwrapped image alone is quite weird. So before we actually start to paint, I'll quickly set up the reverse operation to the unwrap, which is, ta-da, the rewrap. Just pull in the node and connect the data port from the 3D scene node and the image from the paint node. Silhouette will figure out the rest. I'll quickly use a composite node to comp my rewrapped head over the original footage and set the second viewer up so that I can see the result. But as the unwrapped texture is rock solid, I don't have to worry about any of the movement that our talent's head is doing. Silhouette's healing brush comes in really handy. Just add my paint strokes, process them through, and easy as that, our retouch is done. This already worked quite nicely, but not all shots are created equal. Let's take a look at this one, where the talent is using this makeup brush. If I track the head, it does an okay job, but there's a bump right here. That happens because while she's starting to smile, she's also moving the brush right over a large portion of her face. I could probably get rid of this bump with a couple of anchor points, but there's a smarter way, and that's to tell HeadTrackML to ignore the brush in the first place. The 3D scene node has this little input on the side for an occlusion mat. So let me very quickly create a holdout mat for this. I'll go to this frame where the brush is pretty visible. With MaskML, I'll prompt for a brush, and there's my mat. All I need to do now is to pipe this into a Mat Assist ML node and propagate it throughout the clip. And just to give me a bit of wiggle room, I'll add a mat repair node to grow the mat out a bit. Now I can pipe this into the occlusion mat input here and make sure to set the occlusion source to occlusion net. And let's retract that head. Less bumpy already. Additionally, I can play around with the smoothness, which might help with the accuracy, but could also leave me with residual jitter on the head track if pulled too low. Last but not least, I'll still add some deformers, but thanks to the occlusion mat, my initial track is much more precise, so they don't have to do as much of the heavy lifting. Let's do a little time jump. I painted on the unwrapped image and that way gave our talent a little beauty treatment, just as I did in the first example. Now that I got the skin cleaned up, I'd love to do some digital makeup with the head mesh. I'll start with brightening up the area right below her eyes. And for that, I'll take a nice easy shortcut, because with my head track and unwrap already done, I can just branch off from here. But before, I'll have to make sure that I switch my output port to RGB only. That way I can ensure my alpha stays transparent. From there, I'll bring in a roto node and draw a roto around the area I want to brighten. There we go. And now, I'll just bring in another rewrap node, connect it just like the first one to the 3D scene node, and use it to rewrap the mask. Now I'll just need an alpha composite node to subtract the brush, and voila, I can feed that into the color correction and give her a bit of a fresher look. But it doesn't end there. In the 3D Nodes tab, I've got the Render Depth node, and with that, I can use the mesh data from the 3D scene node to render out a depth mat of the head, which is pretty convenient if you want to do digital makeup with some nice fall-off. So here, I already prepped the mat of the cheeks and rewrapped that. It's exactly the same process as with the color correction we just did. But here comes the kicker. Now we can combine our rewrapped cheek mat with the render depth node and multiply them to have a pronounced edge on the cheek, but have the mat slowly fade off using the depth mat. And now I can use the scale values of the render depth node to adjust the blending towards the edges. So I'll pipe this into a color corrector and apply some rouge to her cheeks. Before we close out this video, let's take a look at some more examples, and let's also talk about some of the limitations of this tool. So take a look at this shot. 6 people and 6 heads fooling around. Now HeadTrack ML will detect multiple heads, that's not the issue here. But with these 2 pranksters in the back, the model is having a hard time getting a proper track. On some frames, it just stops the track, but granted, about 80% of the head is hidden behind the other people. But also, when the track is so poor, HeadTrack ML can lose the consistency and the meshes might jump from one person to another. Now in these cases, there's not that much that you can do, but to disable the bad tracks here in the objects list. But still, the 4 most prominent faces track beautifully. Now, as you might have expected, you'll need a separate unwrap and rewrap process for each individual head. But that's easy, as you just need to select the head you want to unwrap here from the drop-down list, and select the same head in the corresponding rewrap node. Or don't, but that might give you some funky face swaps, so be aware. While we are on the topic of groups of heads, let's take a look at this shot. This guy is closest to the camera, this one is in the middle, and the woman is the furthest away. But if I go to my quad view up here, we can see that we've got 3 different sized heads all sitting on the same plane. Now I seriously doubt that the guy in the front has a head twice as large as the woman in the back. Long story short, HeadTrack ML has got no idea of the relative distance between the heads. Still, if you want to render out a depth map for all heads, you can do so by checking Render All in the Render Depth node, and Silhouette will figure out an order. So HeadTrack ML allows you to apply an unwrapping, rewrapping workflow that was previously only available to simple rigid geometries like cards, now to organically moving and deforming heads. That should help with any kind of beauty retouch or digital makeup that could be thrown your way. And with it being placed right inside of Silhouette's node tree, the possibilities of how to use this feature are literally endless. If you want to dive deeper into the other tools inside of Silhouette, check out the video library at borisfx.com. There you can also find great content for all the other tools we have. I'm Christoph Zapletal for Boris FX, and I will see you in another video.